Secure network equipment. Preventing the use of network equipment with backdoors requires a zero-trust approach to hardware. You can't always see a backdoor, so you have to build defenses as if one might already exist. Preventing the use of network equipment with backdoors is not just a technical issue, it's a supply chain, procurement, security architecture, and operational governance issue. Here is a summary of the best practices to secure your infrastructure. 1. Choose trusted vendors and secure supply chains. The first line of defense is ensuring the equipment comes from a verifiable, reputable source. Vetted vendors only purchase from authorized resellers to avoid gray market gear that may have been tampered with. Hardware provenance. Use vendors that provide a software bill of materials, SBOM, which lists every component and library used in the device. Physical inspection. Check for tampered seals or unusual physical modifications, like added chips or unexplained wires, upon delivery. Use vendors with transparent development processes. Look for Secure Development Lifecycle, SDL, documentation, independent third-party audits, security certification history, open vulnerability disclosure program. Avoid black box or unverified manufacturers. Unknown/low-cost vendors may use components or firmware from untrusted sources. Use equipment certified by trusted standards. Examples: Common Criteria, CC, FIPS 140-2/3 February 3, 2900, Network Equipment Cybersecurity, ISO/IEC 27001/62443 for industrial networks. 2. Verify firmware and software integrity. Standard out-of-the-box settings are often the most vulnerable. Disable unnecessary services, turn off Telnet, UPnP, and any debugging ports, like JTAG, that are not required for production. Change default credentials. This sounds basic, but many backdoors are actually just hard-coded administrative accounts that haven't been disabled. Firmware verification. Always verify the hash, checksum, of firmware updates against the manufacturer's website to ensure the code hasn't been altered by a third party. Require digitally signed firmware. Backdoored firmware becomes harder to install when bootloaders enforce signed images. Devices verify signature before boot. Use firmware from official vendor channels only. Never use unofficial mirrors. Modified ROMs. Suspicious debug firmware. Checksum/hash verification. Verify firmware image integrity, SHA-256 or similar, before deployment. 3. Perform independent security testing. Penetration testing, black box/white box. Look for hard-coded credentials, undocumented services, unexpected open ports, debug interfaces, left-enabled firmware. Reverse engineering and static analysis. Organizations with capability can scan firmware for unsafe code, identify undocumented services, analyze binary behavior, network behavior monitoring. Watch for unusual outbound connections, traffic to unknown IPs or domains, encrypted channels to vendor not documented. 4. Harden the deployment environment. Disable unnecessary services. Turn off Telnet HTTP. Use HTTPS only. Remote management protocols not needed. Enforce access controls. Multi-factor admin access, role-based access control, ACLS, limiting who can configure the device. Physically secure network devices. Backdoors can be planted by inserting rogue hardware modules, modifying firmware physically. 5. Zero trust architecture for network equipment. If a device has a backdoor, you must prevent it from phoning home to its command and control server. Microsegmentation. Isolate critical equipment in its own VLAN. If a switch is compromised, it shouldn't be able to talk to your database servers. Egress filtering. Strictly control outbound traffic. Most network gear shouldn't need to initiate a connection to a random IP address in a foreign country. Out-of-band management. Keep the management interface of your equipment on a completely separate physical or logical network that is not reachable from the internet. Even trusted devices can fail. Use architectural controls. Network segmentation. If one device is compromised, it cannot affect the entire network. Least privileged devices should have only the routes, ACL permissions, and access they actually need. Outbound traffic restrictions. Network equipment should never freely contact unknown cloud hosts, unapproved update servers, vendor servers outside pre-approved ranges. 6. Supply chain risk management, SCRM, vendor risk analysis, country of origin, ownership structure, regulatory compliance, transparency of components, chain of custody documentation. Ensure the device was not modified during shipping by distributors, by subcontractors. Use trusted hardware procurement channels. Avoid gray market hardware it may carry modified firmware, counterfeit components, additional radios/antennas. 7. Continuous monitoring and threat detection. Backdoors are often discovered by observing unusual behavior rather than finding the code itself. Traffic analysis. Use a network detection and response (NDR) tool to flag heartbeat signals or data exfiltration attempts. Integrity checks. Regularly use tools to verify that the bootloader and OS haven't been modified. Secure boot. Behavioral anomaly detection. Use IDS/IPS or NDR to detect strange device behavior, unusual DNS queries, unexpected firmware changes. Syslog and configuration integrity checking. Monitor configuration diffs, illegal changes, suspicious reboots, regular firmware updates. Backdoors may be introduced or removed in firmware updates. Monitor change logs carefully. Pro tip: look for equipment that supports hardware root of trust, ROT. This uses a dedicated, tamper-proof chip to ensure the device only runs authentic, signed software from the moment it powers on. 8. Defense in depth against potential backdoors. Even if a device contains a backdoor, layered controls can mitigate the impact. Firewall rules limiting devices communication, strict routing policies, outbound DNS filtering, internal TLS everywhere, disable remote management by default, monitor management plane traffic. 9. Procurement policies and governance. Organizations should define policies like approved vendor lists, mandatory security evaluations, stable firmware baselines, mandatory third-party audits for critical devices, periodic compliance reviews. These prevent the introduction of high-risk equipment. 10. Replace high-risk legacy or untrusted devices when possible. Migrate away from outdated devices with weak security models. Retire hardware that cannot verify firmware signatures. Remove unsupported / end-of-life devices. Summary: preventing backdoored network equipment requires secure vendor selection, firmware integrity checks, independent security testing, hardening and least privilege, continuous monitoring, zero trust architecture, strong supply chain governance. No single control is enough. The goal is a layered, systematic defense that makes backdoors ineffective even if they exist.